The dust of the high desert base tasted like copper and old grudges. Sarah felt the grit between her teeth as she stared down at the polished black boots of Captain Miller. He stood over her, his shadow long and cold against the dry earth, while the rest of the unit watched in a silence that felt like a physical weight. Sarah's hands were raw, pressed into the gravel, her white uniform, once pristine, now stained with the red clay of a training ground she should never have been on. Miller leaned down, his voice a low, jagged rasp that only she could hear. "You don't belong here, sweetheart," he whispered, loud enough for the nearby soldiers to snicker. "This isn't a playground for little girls playing dress-up. Go back to the kitchen before you get someone killed." Sarah didn't flinch, she didn't cry, she just looked up at him, her eyes as calm as the center of a hurricane, while the sun beat down on a scene of total humiliation. They thought they were breaking a rookie. They thought they were teaching a lesson to a woman who had dared to walk into their boys' club with a clean uniform and a quiet confidence. But Miller and his inner circle had no idea that they weren't just crossing a subordinate. They were unknowingly digging their own graves. By the end of this day, the power dynamic on this base would flip so violently that Miller would be left begging for the very mercy he refused to show. He thought he was the king of this desert outpost, but he was about to find out that the woman he just pushed into the dirt held the power to end his career with a single phone call. The trap was set, the evidence was gathered, and the clock was ticking down to the moment the stars would finally come out, and not the ones in the sky. The story really began 3 weeks earlier when Sarah arrived at the gates of Fort Thorne. To everyone else, she was just Sarah Jenkins, a transfer who seemed a bit too old for her supposed rank and a bit too quiet for the chaos of a combat-ready base. She arrived in a beat-up civilian car, carrying a single duffel bag. When she checked into the barracks, the whispers started immediately. The base was notorious for being a black hole, a place where officers like Miller ran things like a personal fiefdom, far away from the prying eyes of the Pentagon. Miller had built a system of kickbacks, ego-driven hazing, and suppressed reports. He didn't want anyone new, and he certainly didn't want someone who looked like they actually followed the rules. From day one, Miller made Sarah his primary target. He assigned her the most grueling watches, the most degrading maintenance tasks, and ensured she was constantly isolated from the rest of the unit. He wanted her to quit. He wanted her to run back to wherever she came from so he could go back to his comfortable, corrupt routine. During a morning briefing, he purposely gave her the wrong coordinates for a supply drop, then screamed at her in front of 100 soldiers when the mission failed. Sarah took the verbal abuse without a word, standing at stiff attention while Miller turned purple, calling her incompetent and a waste of taxpayer money. What Miller didn't notice was the small, digital recorder tucked into her pocket, or the way she was mentally cataloging every name and face of the officers who laughed along with him. The tension reached a breaking point during the annual Founders Day exercise. This was supposed to be a standard drill, but Miller decided to turn it into a gauntlet for Sarah. He ordered her to lead a point position in the middle of a simulated live fire zone, then lost communication with her unit. He left her out in the heat for 6 hours without water, watching from the air-conditioned command tent via drone feed. He laughed with his lieutenants, joking that they should see how long the new girl would last before she fainted. But Sarah didn't faint. She moved through the scrub brush with a tactical precision that should have been a red flag to anyone paying attention. She moved like someone who had spent years in the field, someone who knew exactly how to stay invisible. When Sarah finally walked back into the base, drenched in sweat and covered in dust, Miller met her at the gate. He didn't offer water. Instead, he threw a shovel at her feet. "You're late for the perimeter check, Jenkins," he barked. "Start digging. We need a new trench by 0600. The other soldiers watched, some with pity, others with the cruel satisfaction of seeing someone else suffer so they didn't have to. Sarah picked up the shovel. She began to dig. She dug for hours under the harsh floodlights, her hands blistering. Every shovel full of dirt was a testament to Miller's arrogance. He felt untouchable. He felt like a god in this patch of sand. He had no clue that Sarah had been sent here specifically because of the anonymous reports of his corruption. She wasn't just a soldier, she was the solution. The climax arrived on a Tuesday morning. The entire base was ordered to the main parade ground for a surprise inspection from the regional command. Miller was frantic. He spent the morning screaming at everyone to polish their boots and hide the evidence of their lackluster maintenance. He saw Sarah, still in her dirt-stained fatigues from the night before, and lost his mind. "I told you to stay out of sight," he roared, grabbing her by the shoulder and shoving her toward the back of the line. "You're a disgrace to this uniform. If the Admiral sees you, I'll make sure you're dishonorably discharged by noon. Get in the dirt, Jenkins. Get down and stay there until I tell you otherwise." That was the moment he pushed her, the moment she landed on her knees in the gravel, the moment captured by the eyes of every soldier on the base. Just then, a black SUV with tinted windows and 4-star plates rolled onto the tarmac. Miller straightened his jacket, wiped the sweat from his brow, and put on his best fake smile. He marched toward the vehicle, ready to shake hands with the high-ranking official he expected to see. The door opened, but no one stepped out. Instead, a young aide-de-camp stepped forward and looked at Miller with a gaze of pure ice. "Where is she?" the aide asked. Miller blinked, confused. "Where is who, sir?" "The Admiral is already here," the aide replied, looking past Miller toward the woman kneeling in the dirt. Sarah stood up. She didn't brush the dust off her pants. She didn't fix her hair. She simply walked past a frozen Captain Miller and toward the SUV. The aide-de-camp snapped to the sharpest salute Miller had ever seen. Sarah reached into the vehicle, pulled out a crisp, dark blue jacket with the heavy gold braid of a rear admiral, and slipped it on over her dirt-caked shirt. The silence that fell over the parade ground was so absolute it felt like the wind itself had stopped blowing. Miller's face went from pale to a ghostly, sickly green. His knees literally wobbled. The woman he had spent weeks tormenting, the woman he had just shoved into the ground, was the very person who held his entire future in her hands. Admiral Sarah Jenkins turned around. She didn't look angry, she looked disappointed, which was far worse. "Captain Miller," she said, her voice carrying across the silent rows of soldiers. "You told me earlier that I didn't belong here. You told me I was a disgrace to the uniform." Miller tried to speak, but his throat had seized up. He looked like a man watching his own execution. "I've spent the last 20 days living in your barracks, eating your food, and enduring your leadership," Sarah continued. "And what I've found is a cancer in this command. You didn't see a leader when you looked at me. You saw a target, and that is exactly why you are no longer fit to lead these men." The fallout was swift and devastating. Within the hour, Miller and his 3 top lieutenants were stripped of their sidearms and escorted to the brig. The new girl wasn't just there to observe, she was there to clean house. She spent the rest of the day in the commander's office, not as a victim, but as the ultimate authority. She reviewed the files, signed the arrest warrants, and began the long process of restoring honor to a base that had lost its way. The soldiers who had laughed at her now stood at a distance, terrified, but Sarah didn't seek revenge against the rank and file. She sought justice against the men who had corrupted them. As she prepared to leave the base a week later, Sarah stood at the same spot where Miller had pushed her into the dirt. The base was different now. The air felt lighter. A young private, one who had once offered her a secret bottle of water during her grueling trench digging, walked by and saluted. Sarah returned it with a smile. She knew that the lesson of Fort Thorne would ripple through the entire military. It was a reminder that rank is earned through character, not just stripes, and that you should never mistake silence for weakness. Miller had seen a girl in the dirt. He should have looked closer and seen the storm that was about to break over his head. Life has a funny way of leveling the playing field when we least expect it. We often judge people by their appearance, their position, or their temporary circumstances, forgetting that everyone has a story we know nothing about. Captain Miller thought he was powerful because he could bully those below him, but true power lies in integrity and the courage to do what is right when no one is watching. Karma doesn't always arrive with a loud bang. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, wearing a dusty uniform and a patient smile. If this story reminded you that justice eventually finds its way to those who abuse their power, hit that subscribe button. Let's keep believing in the power of truth. Would you like me to write a follow-up story about how the base changed under Sarah's new command?